Inside Red Onion State Prison. America's most brutal Supermax exposed. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. When the wind cuts through Wise County, Virginia, it carries the chill of the Appalachian Mountains, a quiet, almost deceiving calm. Hidden deep within these ridges stands a fortress of gray concrete and razor wire, Red Onion State Prison, the facility that the Virginia Department of Corrections once called its model of control. To the men who live inside, it earned another name, the Box on the Mountain. Built in the late 1990s, Red Onion rose during a period when Virginia sought to end prison violence through isolation. The state had dismantled parole, expanded sentencing, and poured millions into super-maximum security architecture modeled after the federal prison at Marion, Illinois. Red Onion opened its gates in 1998, taking in prisoners from every corner of the state, the fighters, the gang leaders, the men labeled beyond rehabilitation. From the sky, the complex looks like a symmetrical wheel, its cell blocks radiating from a central control tower. Each housing unit holds tiers of single-man cells, 8 by 10-foot rectangles of concrete with a steel door and a narrow window slotted like a gun barrel. For most of the roughly 800 inmates, life meant 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, 1 hour alone in a small outdoor pen they called the dog run. Officials described the design as humane, a safe environment to separate the violent from the vulnerable. But from the beginning, lawyers and watchdogs warned that Red Onion's silence concealed something darker. In 2000, early lawsuits began to allege racial segregation, beatings, and retaliation against those who complained. The complaints rarely reached headlines. They were buried in handwritten petitions and letters mailed from the mountain. Inside, time moved differently. The fluorescent lights never dimmed, and the intercom buzzed without warning. Meals slid through a slot. Conversations between cells happened through air vents or coded knocks on the pipe. Some inmates scratched notes on toilet paper and floated them along the plumbing to the next cell, a fragile network of human contact. "You can hear a man lose his mind in there," one prisoner wrote in a 2001 letter later cited in a court filing. "He starts talking to the light, then screaming at the walls." According to official policy, officers were required to check each inmate every 30 minutes. According to dozens of affidavits collected years later by Human Rights Watch, those checks often meant a quick glance through the door window, or none at all. Some inmates claimed they would shout for medical help and wait hours. A few said they learned to flood their cells just to draw attention. Red Onion quickly gained a reputation inside Virginia's correctional network. Guards from across the state requested transfers there. The pay was higher, the authority absolute. Training emphasized control, minimal conversation, maximum compliance. "Hands behind your back, face the wall," was the daily refrain. Inmates who hesitated risked being sprayed with pepper gas, a tactic permitted under policy but allegedly abused, according to multiple investigations. By 2004, civil rights lawyers had compiled stacks of testimonies describing what they called a pattern of routine force. Men recounted being extracted from cells by 5-man teams in riot gear, chained to restraint chairs, and left for hours after minor rule violations. The Department of Corrections denied systematic abuse, insisting that Red Onion maintains order among the state's most dangerous offenders. But photographs and medical logs later cited in court suggested a harsher reality. Dislocated shoulders, chemical burns, fractured wrists, all recorded as resisting staff orders. The psychology of isolation. The human mind is not built for silence. In 2012, Human Rights Watch released a report titled Out of Sight: Supermaximum Security Confinement in Virginia. Dozens of prisoners at Red Onion described hallucinations, voices whispering, shadows moving, sudden rage followed by deep numbness. Psychologists interviewed for the report warned that isolation beyond 15 days could trigger permanent damage. At Red Onion, some had spent years. One of the most widely cited cases was William Thorpe, verified public record, name unchanged. Convicted of robbery, he entered Red Onion in the early 2000s after fights in lower security facilities. He told investigators from the Washington Post in 2016 that nights were filled with screams that don't sound human. He began to believe the ventilation system carried the voices of other inmates begging for help. "It's like ghosts in the concrete," he said. His description became a metaphor repeated in countless documentaries and op-eds, the ghosts of Red Onion. Another voice emerged from the same walls. Kevin Rashid Johnson, an activist and artist whose published letters appeared in The Guardian and Vice News. Johnson's accounts were stark: beatings for filing grievances, denial of medical care, and what he called the weaponization of silence. "They take your mind first," he wrote, "then they take your hope." The Department of Corrections disputed his claims, but his letters ignited a national conversation on solitary confinement. A system built to be invisible. Access to Red Onion was tightly controlled. Journalists needed months of clearance. Visitors met inmates through thick glass and monitored phones. Even lawyers reported restricted communication. The isolation was not just physical, it was informational. Few Americans had ever heard of the place until advocacy groups began to publish first-hand accounts online. According to investigative pieces by the Intercept, 2019, and the Washington Post, Red Onion functioned as a laboratory for control. The prison's step-down program, launched in 2012, was meant to offer a path out of segregation. In theory, prisoners could progress through levels of behavior and earn transfer to lower security. In practice, according to Amnesty International, progress often stalled for reasons the inmates could not understand. Some completed all required steps but remained in isolation, a cycle critics said mirrored psychological conditioning rather than rehabilitation. Staff members who later spoke anonymously to reporters admitted that the culture rewarded strict discipline. One former corrections officer told Vice News, "If an inmate raised his voice, we wrote him up. If he smiled, we called it manipulation." Yet not all guards supported the system. Several told researchers they believed long-term segregation creates the very violence it seeks to prevent. The geography of control. Red Onion's remote location was strategic. Wise County sits more than 6 hours from Richmond, near the Kentucky border, surrounded by coal mining towns hit hard by economic decline. The prison provided steady employment where few options remained. Generations of families came to work there, fathers, sons, and cousins wearing the same uniform. For the locals, the prison was an economic lifeline. For the inmates, it was exile. Transfers to Red Onion effectively severed family contact. Few relatives could afford the trip through winding mountain roads. Phone calls were short and expensive, letters delayed by censorship review. In this isolation, inmates built new forms of communication: mirror flashes between recreation cages, coded raps on concrete, hidden notes in library books. Human Rights Watch researchers noted that such improvisations were often punished as gang activity. Yet to many prisoners, they were the only way to stay sane. "If you don't talk to someone, you forget how," one former inmate told a 2018 ACLU interview. Cracks in the wall. The first major outside scrutiny came after multiple suicides between 2010 and 2012. Court documents revealed at least 4 deaths linked to mental health crises in segregation. In one case, an inmate was found hanging in his cell hours after staff had reportedly logged routine wellness checks. The Department of Corrections investigated internally and declared procedures were followed. Advocates disagreed. The outcry pushed the state to launch the step-down program and partner with the Vera Institute of Justice to review solitary confinement practices. Initial reports praised small improvements, more out-of-cell time, access to tablets, and limited group classes. But follow-up evaluations found that many participants remained locked down due to vague infractions like failure to follow orders. By 2016, Red Onion's segregation population still exceeded 70%. Solitary Watch described it as a supermax in everything but name. Even as national attention turned toward criminal justice reform, the prison statistics barely changed. A moment of exposure. In 2016, The Washington Post ran an investigative feature exposing the daily realities of Red Onion. Reporters gathered testimonies from inmates, staff, and psychologists. The headline called it, "The Prison That Buries Men Alive." The story shocked readers across the country. Images of gray corridors, pepper spray stains on walls, restraint chairs stored in narrow rooms. Virginia officials defended the facility as necessary for public safety, noting that many prisoners were convicted of violent crimes. Yet critics argued that punishment had eclipsed any notion of rehabilitation. Public debate intensified when the Intercept, 2019, published a follow-up linking Red Onion to a national trend of torture by design. The article compared architectural blueprints from multiple state supermaxes and concluded that the layouts themselves enforced psychological pressure: narrow sightlines, constant lighting, restricted movement. Red Onion's design, nearly identical to the federal ADX Florence, became a symbol of systemic cruelty disguised as security. Inside voices. Among those still confined, letters continued to leak out. Some arrived at advocacy offices smeared with coffee and stamped, "Inspected by Vadok." One inmate, whose name remains withheld for privacy, wrote in 2019, "They tell us the step-down program is freedom, but the steps keep moving. You can pass every level and still wake up in the same cell. The only thing that changes is you." The letter was published by Solitary Watch under the title Red Onion: My Mind on Lock. It drew hundreds of responses from readers who had never heard of the prison before. Psychologists reading these letters noted recurring themes: identity erosion, chronic fear, mistrust of sound. Inmates described counting the bricks, memorizing screw patterns, and speaking to imaginary companions. One wrote, "When they open the door, the light hurts my eyes like fire." The official line. The Virginia Department of Corrections maintained a consistent public stance that Red Onion housed individuals who pose a serious threat to staff or other offenders, and that its operations met constitutional standards. In press statements, the department emphasized staff training, internal audits, and external partnerships aimed at reducing isolation. Officials highlighted success stories: inmates who completed the step-down program and re-entered lower security facilities without incident. Yet, data obtained through Freedom of Information requests painted a different picture. Between 2012 and 2020, dozens of inmates reportedly cycled in and out of segregation without achieving full release. Some described the program's final stage as paper freedom, a status that changed little in daily life. Human cost. By the time the world entered the 2020s, Red Onion had become more than a prison, it was a case study. Documentaries, academic papers, and human rights panels cited it as evidence of America's dependence on extreme isolation. For activists, it symbolized the line between justice and cruelty. For policymakers, a question of safety versus sanity. Former inmates who survived years inside compared the experience to being buried awake. One man, interviewed by NPR News in 2021 after his release, said he still slept with the lights on because darkness reminded him of lockdown. Another confessed he panicked in crowds because silence had become his comfort. "Freedom felt louder than the prison," he said. Today, the drive to Red Onion passes through mist-covered valleys and silent coal towns. The facility still operates, its towers gleaming in the mountain sun. The state insists reforms continue. Advocates say not enough has changed. Every year, new reports emerge, repeating the same phrases: prolonged isolation, psychological harm, systemic abuse. For many Americans, Red Onion remains invisible, hidden by geography and indifference. Yet behind its steel doors, men still count the minutes, listening to echoes that never fade. The step-down illusion, reform or retaliation. By 2012, pressure on Virginia's Department of Corrections had reached a breaking point. The outcry from advocacy groups, lawsuits from prisoners, and a growing media spotlight forced officials to promise reform. What emerged from that storm was the step-down program, a supposed path out of solitary confinement for inmates at Red Onion State Prison. On paper, it sounded like a breakthrough. The department announced that prisoners could now earn their way out of segregation through good behavior, educational participation, and demonstrated progress in anger management. Officials presented the program as a humane evolution. Instead of indefinite isolation, inmates could graduate through 4 levels until they reached general population. It was, according to state press releases, a behavioral roadmap toward rehabilitation. But for the men inside, that roadmap often led in circles. Promises on paper. The step-down program began with optimism. When it launched in 2012, the Vera Institute of Justice partnered with VADOC to monitor early results. Initial reports suggested small victories. Some prisoners moved into dual cells, where 2 inmates could share space for limited hours. Others were allowed group recreation under close supervision. The department called it a success. News outlets quoted administrators saying that violence had dropped, morale had improved, and inmates were motivated by the possibility of progress. Yet those same reports included a quiet warning that meaningful change would depend on how officers enforced the program inside the cell block. Policy means little without culture, one Vera researcher told the Richmond Times-Dispatch. If staff see this as leniency, they'll sabotage it. That prediction came true almost immediately. Inside the levels, the program divided inmates into stages, Level A through Level D. At Level A, prisoners remained in near total isolation, locked in their cells 23 hours a day, shackled for the 1 hour outside. To advance, they had to complete packets of cognitive behavioral assignments, show consistent compliance, and avoid disciplinary infractions for 90 days. Level B allowed slightly more recreation time. Level C offered limited contact programs. Level D was the promised land, access to general population and a chance to transfer out of Red Onion altogether. But as dozens of inmates later told Amnesty International and Solitary Watch, the system felt rigged. Guards wrote infractions for the smallest actions, talking through the door, refusing a meal, or failing to stand quickly enough during count. Each write-up reset progress, sending prisoners back to Level A. A single pepper spray incident could erase months of good behavior. It's like walking up a down escalator, wrote one inmate in a 2014 grievance form later cited by Amnesty. No matter how far you climb, someone at the top hits the button and you slide back down. By 2015, hundreds of prisoners had entered the step-down system. Few ever reached Level D. Psychological warfare. What made the step-down program particularly devastating was its illusion of choice. On the surface, inmates were told they could control their fate. In reality, that control depended on subjective evaluations by staff. Officers graded behavior on weekly matrix sheets, using categories like positive attitude, appropriate tone, and acceptance of responsibility. According to an internal report obtained by the Intercept, the criteria were highly discretionary. One officer's tolerance was another officer's violation. Prisoners soon realized that personal bias, and sometimes race, determined progress more than behavior. Human rights observers documented stark racial disparities. black inmates were less likely to advance and more likely to be written up for disrespect. The department denied discrimination, but numbers told their own story. In 2016, over 70% of inmates in Red Onion's segregation units were African American, though the state's population was barely 20%. Psychologists reviewing the data called it behavioral entrapment. When prisoners believed they could never win, some stopped trying. Others rebelled, flooding cells, refusing food, or attacking officers in desperation. Each act reinforced the system's justification for isolation. The cycle became self-fulfilling. The retaliation problem. One of the most explosive allegations came from prisoners who claimed the step-down program was used not as rehabilitation but as retaliation. Those who filed grievances or spoke to the media often found themselves demoted back to the first level or placed on indefinite lockdown. Letters published by Solitary Watch between 2014 and 2019 describe what inmates called administrative revenge. When you write up a complaint, one letter said, they take your mattress for inspection, spray the cell, and start your level over. The program's not for stepping down, it's for breaking down. A 2018 federal lawsuit, Johnson v. Clark, alleged exactly that. Prisoners who criticized staff were punished with loss of step-down privileges. The case was settled out of court without an admission of wrongdoing, but it confirmed what many already suspected: the system was being weaponized. Former correctional employees later told reporters they witnessed favoritism and manipulation. Some supervisors wanted certain inmates to fail, one retired officer admitted to Vice News. They'd look for any excuse. The message was simple: we run this place, not the program. Life at the bottom. For those trapped at Level A, life barely differed from pre-reform days. The cells remained the same: small, gray, window-slit rooms with bolted furniture and a steel toilet. Lights stayed on around the clock. Food arrived on plastic trays through a slot. Once a week, officers ordered the prisoners out for a rec, but the cage was hardly larger than the cell itself. To many, the psychological toll felt worse because hope had been dangled in front of them. Before the program, they expected nothing. Now, they expected freedom that never came. Human Rights Watch quoted one prisoner who said, "The program plays with your mind. They tell you you're improving, then they reset you. After a while, you stop believing in days." Mental health professionals visiting the facility observed alarming symptoms: self-mutilation, insomnia, paranoia, and what they called flattened affect, emotional numbness that often preceded suicide attempts. A 2017 Vera Institute audit confirmed that nearly 40% of inmates in segregation reported serious mental health concerns, yet only a fraction received continuous therapy. The audit also found that some staff mocked prisoners who asked for counseling. Notes from the report quote one officer saying, "They all crazy in here. Therapy's not gonna fix that." When the findings were leaked, the department promised additional training. But insiders said the culture barely changed. Outside the fence, beyond the razor wire, the public narrative shifted. Officials in Richmond cited the step-down program as evidence of progress. At conferences, they displayed charts showing reductions in solitary confinement numbers. But independent researchers argued those figures were misleading. Many prisoners were simply reclassified under different terminology, not actually freed from isolation. By 2019, national outlets like the New York Times and The Guardian began questioning Virginia's claims. Investigations revealed that while the department had reduced administrative segregation, it had increased a category called intensive management, which imposed almost identical conditions. The label changed, but the experience remained the same. In 2020, The Washington Post revisited Red Onion and found that out of 800 prisoners, roughly half still spent more than 20 hours a day alone. Officials defended the practice as necessary for safety. Critics saw it as bureaucratic sleight of hand. Amnesty International summarized it bluntly. The step-down program, as implemented, functions less as reform and more as public relations. The human experiment. Scholars studying the program compared it to a psychological experiment in obedience. The structure rewarded submission and punished defiance, regardless of actual rehabilitation. To progress, inmates had to sign responsibility statements, admitting guilt and promising cooperation. Those who maintained innocence in disputed cases were labeled non-compliant and barred from advancement. One prisoner, identified only as D.J. in court filings, refused to sign. He insisted his assault charge was fabricated during a cell extraction. Because he would not confess, he remained at level A for over 3 years. His letters, published later by Solitary Watch, read like scientific observations of isolation. My dreams are flat. The air hums. I can't tell if I'm awake. Legal experts warned that such coercive conditions could violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Yet federal courts often deferred to prison administrators, citing security concerns. Without definitive rulings, the step-down program continued unchanged. The outside voices grow louder. By 2021, public awareness of solitary confinement had reached new intensity. Civil rights documentaries and podcasts began featuring Red Onion alongside ADX Florence and Pelican Bay as symbols of the Supermax era. Former prisoners appeared on panels describing what they called psychological dismemberment. Their testimonies sparked legislative proposals in multiple states to limit isolation beyond 15 days, echoing the United Nations Mandela rules. In Virginia, lawmakers debated bills to cap solitary confinement but faced opposition from correctional unions. The measures stalled. During one hearing, a former Red Onion inmate testified remotely. His voice trembled as he described spending 11 years in near-continuous isolation. I thought the step-down would save me, he said. Instead, it taught me how to disappear without dying. The chamber fell silent. Reporters later quoted a delegate whispering, "That's the first time we've really heard them." Incremental change. Under mounting scrutiny, VATIC announced modest revisions. More mental health staff were hired. Tablets were introduced for educational use. Prisoners could now video chat with families under supervision. Officials insisted these steps proved the program's evolution. But behind the scenes, many inmates said nothing truly changed. The same guards patrolled the same corridors, the same paperwork decided their fates. In 2022, the ACLU of Virginia released a report stating that the architecture of control remains intact. That same year, civil rights lawyers filed new complaints alleging excessive force during so-called step-down reviews. One plaintiff described being sprayed with OC gas for refusing to sign forms he could not read because of vision impairment. The incident was confirmed in medical logs but dismissed as minimal force. Even reform advocates admitted progress was painfully slow. It's like turning a ship made of concrete, said a Vera Institute analyst. The culture resists change because isolation feels safe, for the system, not the people. Echoes of hope. Yet, amid the stagnation, faint signs of humanity persisted. In 2023, volunteers from a prison literacy nonprofit convinced administrators to allow limited book clubs for higher-level inmates. Participants read The Count of Monte Cristo, discussing revenge, confinement, and redemption. One prisoner reportedly said, "For 2 hours, I wasn't in Red Onion, I was in the story." Such glimpses of normalcy hinted at what could be possible if true rehabilitation replaced fear. Psychologists visiting that session noted reduced tension and calmer behavior for weeks afterward. It was evidence, however small, that contact and purpose could achieve what isolation never could. Still, for most, those moments were rare exceptions. The system's inertia outweighed compassion. The step-down program remained, in the words of one investigator, a ladder that leads back to the same cell. The illusion exposed. By the mid-2020s, the step-down program stood at a crossroad. International human rights observers ranked Red Onion among the most restrictive prisons in the Western world. The department continued to defend it as a model of order, but data and testimonies told another story, one of control masquerading as reform. For the men still living there, the debate outside meant little. Their world was measured in inches, minutes, and levels that never seemed to end. They had become both subjects and spectators in a national argument about punishment, dignity, and what it means to be human. And as one prisoner wrote in a 2024 letter smuggled to a journalist, "They say we're stepping down. But every step I take, the floor moves beneath me." Maybe the only way out of Red Onion is to stop believing there is one. The cost of silence, mental collapse, and accountability. Dawn at Red Onion is almost indistinguishable from night. The fluorescent bulbs hum the same, the vents breathe the same chilled air, and a guard's boots echo down the tier like a metronome that never stops. For men who have spent years in that rhythm, reality begins to loosen. They call it the drift, the slow slide between thinking and remembering, between existing and simply waiting. By the mid-2010s, psychologists who gained limited access to the prison were documenting an epidemic of mental deterioration. Their clinical notes, later cited in Human Rights Watch and Vera Institute papers, described inmates rocking for hours, whispering to invisible people, or clawing their own arms just to feel something. Medication requests tripled in less than 5 years. Yet treatment consisted mainly of tranquilizers and short interviews through steel doors. One therapist recalled to the Washington Post that sessions were conducted through shouting. Guards stood behind her, gloved hands on spray canisters. "You can't build trust with a man while someone's aiming pepper spray at his head," she said. The department insisted therapy was available, but medical logs showed most appointments lasted under 10 minutes. When the mind breaks, the official records mention self-injury incident. Prisoners call them breakdowns. A man named Carter T., whose letters were later published by Solitary Watch, sliced his arm open with a piece of metal torn from his bunk. Another, identified in a 2019 ACLU report only as R.J., repeatedly banged his head until he fractured his skull. Staff recorded both events as disruptive behavior. A 2018 State Inspector General review found that officers often responded to mental health crises with force. Instead of medical intervention, they deployed gas or restraint chairs. One memo noted a case where a suicidal prisoner was left strapped upright for 9 hours after a failed attempt. The officer's justification read, "He might try again." Inmates say screams echo down the block during those nights. The noise carries through vents, seeps into every cell, and settles there. "You can't unhear it," wrote a former inmate named Leo Banks in 2021. "You start hearing it when it's not happening." Accountability denied as lawsuits mounted, the state's defense relied on a single argument, that isolation was a matter of safety, not cruelty. Federal courts repeatedly deferred, citing a long tradition of judicial restraint in prison management. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in 2015 that administrative segregation does not in itself constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Advocates called that decision a shield for abuse. Internal oversight proved equally toothless. Complaints from prisoners passed through grievance officers who often worked under the same wardens accused of misconduct. Of more than 1,000 formal grievances filed between 2014 and 2019, fewer than 3% were upheld. The rest vanished into paperwork or were dismissed as unsubstantiated. When journalists requested disciplinary data through the Freedom of Information Act, much of it arrived blacked out. Security reasons, the redactions said. Even death investigations were opaque. Between 2010 and 2020, at least 7 inmates died under circumstances the department labeled medical. Autopsy reports suggested suicide or complications from restraint, but families rarely received explanations. Whistleblowers on the inside, a handful of employees, tried to speak out. One nurse, later relocated to another facility, told Vice News she resigned after witnessing an officer drag a handcuffed prisoner by his ankle down a corridor. "We were told to chart it as a fall," she said. Another officer anonymously contacted the ACLU describing a code of silence enforced by peer pressure. "If you talk, you're done. No one will cover your back in a fight." Their statements hinted at a workplace shaped by fear as much as authority. Staff who questioned orders risked retaliation. Those who complied earned overtime and stability. In an economically fragile region like Wise County, a state paycheck meant survival. The prison didn't just confine inmates, it employed the town. The politics of pain, every scandal sparked a promise of reform. Governors ordered reviews, commissions held hearings, budgets funded new wellness units. Yet each reform encountered the same wall: public indifference. For many voters, Supermax inmates represented the worst of society, unworthy of empathy. Politicians knew it. "No one loses votes by being tough on criminals," said a former state senator in a 2020 panel. That sentiment hardened Red Onion's isolation policy. When budgets tightened, mental health positions were the first to be cut. Security spending remained untouched. The logic was circular. Violence justified isolation, isolation caused breakdowns, breakdowns proved inmates were violent. A crack in the narrative in 2020, during the pandemic, the fragile order began to splinter. Staff shortages forced longer lockdowns. Outside monitors were barred for health reasons. Prisoners described weeks without showers or recreation. Letters smuggled to advocacy groups painted scenes of confusion and despair. One read, "We don't know if it's day or night anymore. The only time we see people is when they're in hazmat suits." Public attention briefly returned. The New York Times and NPR reported on COVID inside Red Onion. A federal watchdog found that several men exhibiting psychosis were kept in segregation even after testing positive. Quarantine, officials explained. To human rights experts, it was proof that the system's reflex remained isolation. Amid the chaos, 2 lawsuits survived motions to dismiss. Both alleged deliberate indifference to mental health need. The court allowed discovery, a rare victory for prisoners' rights. One attorney involved called it a pinhole of light through 20 years of darkness. Voices beyond the walls. Former inmates who had survived long-term solitary began organizing online. They formed support groups and podcasts with names like Second Hour and Unlocked Mind. Their testimonies reached classrooms, churches, and even some legislators. The phrase "Red Onion Syndrome" entered reform circles to describe post-isolation trauma, flashbacks, anxiety, and social paralysis. In 2022, a documentary crew filmed several of these men as they tried to rebuild lives. One scene showed a former prisoner flinching when his young son hugged him from behind. "In there, nobody touches you unless it's to hurt you," he said softly. The clip went viral, forcing a new wave of public debate. That same year, Virginia's General Assembly quietly inserted language into the state budget requiring VADC to report quarterly on segregation numbers and mental health outcomes. It was a small clause, but it made the department accountable on paper for the first time. The weight of proof. Data released under that mandate revealed a paradox. While the number of inmates labeled segregated had dropped, the average time spent in isolation had increased. In 2023 alone, at least 120 men spent more than 1 year without direct human contact. The department claimed that voluntary confinement and protective custody categories skewed the numbers. Advocates called it statistical disguise. Independent psychiatrists reviewing the data concluded that extended isolation produced symptoms consistent with traumatic brain injury, loss of memory, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Their report warned that releasing such men without treatment risked perpetuating violence beyond prison walls. "We are exporting trauma back into society," it said. A mirror to the nation. By 2024, Red Onion had become a case study in countless university lectures about ethics and criminal justice. Students debated whether safety could ever justify psychological destruction. Some pointed out that countries like Germany and Norway had largely abandoned long-term solitary confinement. The comparison made America's system look medieval. International observers echoed the criticism. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture cited Red Onion in a 2024 brief, warning that prolonged solitary confinement exceeding 15 days constitutes torture under international law. The U.S. State Department disputed that characterization, emphasizing state sovereignty. The political standoff turned human suffering into paperwork. Echoes from the cell. Meanwhile, inside, the routine remained unchanged. At 5 a.m. the lights came on. Doors clanged open for breakfast trays. Guards made their rounds. Somewhere in the block, a man whispered the same line he'd written on his wall, "Still here." Others repeated it like prayer. William Thorpe, the prisoner whose haunting words had once reached national media, was by then serving his final years in a lower security unit. When interviewed for a 2024 follow-up, he said, "I survived Red Onion, but it didn't leave me. It's in the way I breathe." His art, sketched on state-issued envelopes, depicted empty corridors stretching into mirrors. The question that remains. After 2 decades of reports, lawsuits, and reforms, Red Onion State Prison still stands, its towers visible for miles, its silence intact. For every reform announced, another allegation arises. Each investigation concludes with the same phrase, "Further review recommended." The deeper truth is that Red Onion is not just a building but a philosophy, that control can replace care, and silence can replace justice. Until that belief changes, the mountain will keep its ghost. As one anonymous letter sent in 2025 to a journalist closed, "They built this place to contain violence, but they built it out of violence. You can't cure darkness by locking it in a box." Disclaimer: this story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real event. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Sources: Human Rights Watch 2012 to 2024, Out of Sight and Follow-up Report. The Washington Post 2016 to 2023, Inside Red Onion State Prison. Vera Institute of Justice 2017 to 2023, Segregation Reform Assessment. ACLU of Virginia 2022 to 2024, Administrative Segregation Data. Solitary Watch Letters Archive 2014 to 2025. United Nations OHCHR Reports on Solitary Confinement 2024.